Hello, I'm very happy to be here today to talk a little bit about the problem of maize in Mexico and in general, why is this topic important? I think that the broad question about where we come from, is a very important one that we have to talk about in general terms. The question, where does food come from, is very important because it tackles different perspectives. For example, the first thing would be, it's very difficult to know where those food come from. And if we don't know where those food come from, there are many questions regarding not only health, but also the labor conditions of the people that are producing them. Corn or maize is a very important, not only meal, but I would say even a symbol of Mexican culture. And we eat corn almost every day. This is part of our national identity. But corn production is a different subject. Technology, production of food. And when I ask about the production of food, I want to say that the techniques and technologies is at the center. It has been the change from traditional crops to the industrial way of producing food. And this change is not only something that has to do with technology and with machines and money and business, but that is also affecting daily life of the people that are producing food. It is not the same to have an industrialized field like the ones that we have in the country, to have traditional crops in the south of the country. What is at stake from traditional crops to industrialized crops? It's not only the quality of food, for example, in terms of variety, because when you have an industrialized field, you only have one variety of corn. And when you have a traditional crop, you're managing several varieties at the same time. This, of course, concerns biodiversity. And there are many varieties of corn in Mexico that are still alive and are still part of our culture and that we still eat. But the general, I don't know, imagine or the yellow corn that include the purple or the red or diverse varieties of corn. So thinking about this idea of technologies and industrialized fields and the way in which biodiversity and the quality of food and how do people live when you produce the food in a industrialized way or in a traditional way are some of the aspects that need to be addressed when we talk about food. And of course, also labor conditions. And I'm just trying to bring some of the topics to the table in order to talk with you, Ingeborg, about this, because we have talked about this in several times before. And I want to mention that in the collective that I'm part of at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, Arte más Ciencia, we have been working with the topic of food, not only maize and the way that it has been produced with these topics that I just mentioned before, but also with the subject of transgenic corn. What does that know? What is the role of citizen science discussing transgenic corn? The idea of contamination of native crops with transgenic corn, the influence of the United States of America in the way that Mexico controls and develops agriculture / agribusiness, and how can we know and how can we react to the subject of transgenic corn? Of course, the very idea of the seed is a very political one. Who controls the seed controls the food, and who controls the production of the seed also controls the whole chain of production. And now the transgenic corn is forbidden in government that we have, but is always there. But I would say that it's a question about the transgenic or the GMO food, but also about the technologies that are involved in the production of food. It's not to have transgenic food or not, but how are we consuming the food nowadays? Because we are far away from the fields. But
yes, I think these are all very important. These are all very important topics because, but I think it's interesting to see that what was the I would say first step. When did transgenic corn from the US or Canada, especially the US, when did transgenic corn enter Mexico? And this was due to NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was, came into being in 1994. But it took another 15 years until there was a lot of transgenic corn imported. And there's also the fact that, especially in the country or in the part of Mexico in Oaxaca, where scientists and the people themselves believe this is the origin of maize, they were not producing enough maize to feed the people. So this was a good argument or a good chance for the big industry, for agribusiness, for Syngenta, Monsanto, and others to step in. But what I think is interesting, what your working group, what your collective is doing, is that they were able, due to a huge exhibition in 2012 in Mexico City, to present how complex the whole topic is, because you have the indigenous people involved, you have the farmer involved, you have people who are in the political arena who are not interested in understanding the complexity of the situation. And you have, of course, the indigenous people who think that transgenic corn is dead, that they cannot use transgenic corn because it's hybrid in their historical, cultural context. Because maize is a lot more than just food. It's also, like I just said, a cultural symbol. And maybe you would like to talk a little bit about the way you presented this very complex topic in Mexico City.
Yes, thank you, Ingeborg. Many topics to discuss here, because, for example, you said that one of the things that were said that we don't produce enough maize by ourselves, so we have to import it. And this is still true for the moment. Mexico is not producing enough maize for our own population. So this puts us in a condition where we have to import the maize from the United States. So this is quite complex, and it's a thing that has a lot to do with technology, but also with money. Who controls the technology that is used nowadays in the production of food? And this also has to do not only with the very complex relationship, commercial and also cultural and technological relationship that Mexico has with the US, but also with our own history and our own tradition and what happened with the lands after the Mexican Revolution in the 1920s and how it was transform the whole spectrum of who possesses the land and who can work the land. So yes, we are not producing enough maize, but I would say that this is not only a question about technology, but also about labor and how do people want to live, and money, and who is producing the food. At the same time, it's not only something that is related to GMO and transgenic corn. Mexico was important, as you said, in Oaxaca. They think that this is a place of origin of maize, but even before the Second World War, had ended, the Rockefeller Foundation was already putting money in Mexico in order to build a seed bank that is the biggest in the whole world for maize. So they knew since the first part of the 20th century the importance that the food was gonna have for the near future, and they started controlling the seeds, and also labeling it, and also the question about who owns the seed, I mean, in terms of ownership. And they started selling improved seeds. So not only GMO or transgenic food, which are not the same, but since the 60s, they started selling improved seeds to the farmers. And this also is a condition that changes everything, because in the traditional crops, farmers exchange their seeds freely at the market. That, for example, I have this seed that was very good during this season and the other person has another one, and we exchange them freely. But now with the biotech companies involved, these things, it's not that it has to stop, but now it's a dangerous and risky thing to do, because who owns the property of the seeds in terms of economics and things like that is quite complex. And also another important thing to discuss with the green revolution, that it's not the same as the biotech companies in terms of transgenic food, but with the green revolution, a lot of chemicals started to being used in the production of food. And that is also, I think, concerning not only health, but again, biodiversity, for example. And I insist on this question: how do we produce food? What is the relationship that we establish with the earth and with the soil in order to produce food? Because with this kind of technologies, in a way, the soil is nothing but an element, as a mechanic element that is needed in order to get food. And it's not something that is part of nature, and we don't establish, a more fair relationship with our environment. That is why we started in Artema Ciencia developing a project concerning food and corn in 2012, 2013. And we developed an experiment. We wanted to test if there was transgenic corn contamination in Mexico that was not labeled by the government and that people were not aware of. So we are importing, the country is importing seed, it's importing from the US to feed the non-human animals, because they are giving corn to the non-animals, for example, cows. And that is also a big problem and another big concern. Why are we eating cows with corn that is a food that is not good for these animals? But Mexico is importing the seeds from the US, and some of those seeds are transgenic. And it doesn't say that, and nobody knows that. There is a very easy experiment to perform. To have the seed and to grow it, and when we have small sprouts, then we spray that with Monsanto's herbicide, that is Faena in Mexico, is glyphosate, a wide spectrum herbicide that kills everything, kills every weed, kills all the corn except a certain kind of transgenic corn that is being manufactured to be. We developed this experiment first at home and then in the museum. What we could prove is this contamination of transgenic corn that is being given to non-human animals. And it's not only the problem that the animals are eating this food and then we are eating the animals, but also that this seed is, of course, alive. And if you plant it, you will have a transgenic plant. And it's something that is, that nobody is really aware of. And in our opinion, it is of great concern how are we handling, or how are biotech companies handling the transgenic seeds that are like that in the open field in this respect? Because in a different respect, I tried to go here in Mexico City to the offices of Monsanto, for example, and it was impossible to get there. If you ask for a transgenic seed or just to have an interview, it is impossible to get there. You cannot buy transgenic food from Monsanto, from an office, or almost from any place. But the open field, well, at least where the animals are eating those kinds of seeds. So there are many contradictions because biodiversity in Mexico didn't allow us to exhibit a transgenic plant from Arabidopsis in the museum, because it is forbidden to take the plant out of the laboratory in the university. But the transgenic corn that is out there is something like, well, of course, nobody knows what to do with this.
Yeah, but I think it's good that you say it's a matter of looking at the big companies, Monsanto, Syngenta. We have, these 5 huge companies who are ruling the market, who have dominating the market. But what is so interesting with the contamination of the, ancient corn in Oaxaca is that there was call it a scandal, or just call it a really tough and huge debate because the way Nature, the science journal Nature, treated 2 scientists who were able to show that this is happening in Oaxaca, and they said this is not something that we should be aware of that. And then other scientists published again in Nature articles to say, well, this is not proper science. They're not really the scientific research is poorly conducted. The method was wrong, and so on. And in the end, it showed that the scientists that were behind that article were all in a one way or another paid by Monsanto or another, or save the money from the biotech industries. And this was, I think, one of the first time that we really saw how much influence on science, because if you talk to people about science or art, this is they are very positive about it. But if you look at bioscience or people who go into biotech and agriculture, the game is changing immediately, because there's so much capital, so much money involved. And I think this is a good example to show that your collective Arte y Ciencia is trying to show the whole picture, to be critical towards the science, to be critical towards the indigenous people, how they perform their identity, and so on. And I think it's just high time to show that this is not only about transgenic corn or about biodiversity. It's also about how the flow of capital is influencing what we eat, what we have on our dinner table. And I think it's good to quote the people, the Zapoteca, the indigenous people who just don't want to eat that kind of corn, because they say our own corn is much more yummy. We feel healthy. We feel happy producing it, and we feel happy to eat it. And I think one topic would be for the governments on the ground is to foster the farmers and the indigenous communities to produce more of their own corn, because this is what they think is good for their health, is good for their community, is good for what they think is their relationship to nature.
Yeah, but again, many problems related to this. When we were in Oaxaca in 2014, I think, working there, we were not talking to indigenous people. We were talking to rural farmers, to people that speak Spanish and are poor and don't have technology to produce the food. So the kind of situation there were quite complex because, for example, many women were alone because the men went to the US to work there for more money. They had no money to work the fields. There is a lot of alcoholism also at the same time. It's not about being happy producing. It's very hard to produce food in the open without technology, and technology needs money. And once that you introduce technology, then everything changes completely. The way that you live, the relationship that you have with the seed, with the soil. So I would say complex thing is not just going out there to the field and working with your own hands because it's very nice to have your own food. I would say this kind of thinking comes from the cities where we grow balcony, maybe, if we have good weather. Otherwise, it's very, very hard working in the field. So that is why I was saying since the beginning, it's also a question about labor and labor conditions. Who wants to work in the field and in what conditions? But I think that now our time is, and we have to go to the session.
Yeah, but what is interesting is that just one last sentence is that the indigenous community and the people who wanted to help them, that they came up with a kind of nostalgia, that they had, ideas of going back to a pre-industrialized way of farming, which is not possible.
But there are many places that are pre-industrialized in Mexico that still. Just a question about industrializing it because it's better because then you have more.
Hello, thanks for the talk. We have indeed some questions already, and the first one is from me and following up on your talk. So how do you see the future of small farmers? Will they use unaltered corn in the future?
If we survive the pandemic, right? I don't know. There is not an easy answer to the questions because there is a tension between the industrialized part of the country that is in the north and the pre or not industrialized one in the south. So how do you solve this? It's a question about producing more food and injecting more money and more technology. I wouldn't say so. I would say that it is also important to resist capitalism and to have a different understanding of life and environment. And what does that mean? I'm not quite sure about that, but just that the
Okay, thank you. The next question is, are there any experiments or approaches to use old maize kinds that can withstand harder climate conditions with special properties?
I don't know, but we are still eating many varieties of corn. It's alive and circulate. But I don't know if they are performing experiments to see if some of those seeds resist better climate change as a drought or something like that. Okay. Also, we have to remember that Mexico has many weathers. So the maize is adapted to different kind of weathers, not to just one kind of weather. We have several ones because the country is quite big and diverse.
Indeed. Next question from our YouTube audience. Agnes R. asks, are there countries that are more into traditional ways of agribusiness, and if so, how come?
Do you want to answer that?
If there are countries who are more into traditional agriculture than others, of course. You just look at the global south. Of course, they are, highly industrialized countries performing producing their food on an industrial scale, and of course, other, we say, like emerging countries, they are trying to keep up and to same. They chop up their woods to plant palm oil, countries for palm oil and things like that. So we see this. I think there's a big gap in countries like India or like Mexico. There are different types of agriculture within one country, for example.
So the next question is again from me. So I was wondering if you could, María Antonia, if you could explain the notion of transgenic contamination a little bit more in detail, please.
Yes, thank you, Enrique. What I got is that our transgenic plants growing along with native plants. And that is what they call transgenic. I mean, they have found some of those. And because maize goes through cross-pollination, it's very difficult to control when you have an experimental crop, for example, of transgenic corn. Since it goes through cross-pollination, it's very difficult to control that it doesn't spread around. So it gets easily away from your land. And what they try to in fields is to have a belt, a security belt with no crops there. So if it flies with the wind, then it wouldn't contaminate a different crop, but it's better to control it. And the kind of transgenic contamination that we found was in the non-human animals' food. So that's different because it's completely industrialized and it comes like that in the package.
Yeah, thanks. We have no more questions from our YouTube audience yet, but plenty of space for you to give us a little pitch for the future, maybe some wise words for the ending of your first session.
What would you say about the future, Ingeborg?
About the future? Oh, I'm at the moment I'm a bit negative, to be honest. It's the American election coming up. It's the pandemic. This is all man-made global challenges that are rising. But when I look at art and science or art project, for example, in which is like this part of the world, when I see how people start to build communities, how art and also scientists go on the ground and talk to people and try to get involved, then I'm quite hopeful. But when I look, from a distance, what's going on this planet, I'm not that hopeful. But if you look on the ground, I see many positive projects emerging and people changing their attitudes and visions.
And I would ask the question, what does it mean to live in a city? Like, with food consumption is quite an issue, but also surviving the pandemic, the city is also at the center of the debate. Why are we living in mega cities? I mean, even Berlin, that is not as big as Mexico City, is still a huge city. Are crowded everywhere. So it's not a question about just go to the countryside and forget about the city and survive, but an important question about the spaces that we build, live. What is the future? It's a place that is making us sick because everything's crowded and polluted and we have nothing but the streets around. It has also to do with the kind of food that we are able to get in the city because we are not our own food. And why are we not producing our own food? It's also involved the germs and bacteria and viruses that spread easily in a city. And it's a question about the carbon footprint and the vehicles that we use in the cities and so on. So I would say that an important question that we have to ask is, what about the cities? And what are the different ways that we can invent in order to live with a better relationship with the environment and with each other?
Thank you.
Thank you, Enrique.